Imagine this. You're a samurai, not just any samurai, but one of the last 300 warriors alive. For months, you've been surrounded by an army of 10,000 enemies. Your fortress walls are crumbling. Your food is gone. You're eating bark and leather, and the shogunate commander outside has just sent you a message. Surrender, and your death will be quick. Resist, and every man, woman, and child inside this castle will be crucified along the coast for miles. But then you do something the enemy never expected. You don't surrender. You don't pray. You sharpen your sword, light the fuses on your last cannons, and prepare to charge directly into the heart of their army. This isn't a story of survival. This is a story of a last stand so brutal, so strategically brilliant, that it would force Japan's rulers to rewrite the very rules of warfare. But here's the insane part. These weren't rebels fighting for treasure or power. They were starving peasants and masterless samurai fighting for something the shogunate couldn't understand. Something that would make 300 warriors believe they could destroy 10,000. Welcome to the Siege of Hara Castle. This is Amakusa Shiro, at just 16 years old. He's the leader of the rebellion, and boy, did his followers believe in him. They called him the Heavenly Child, a messiah who could work miracles. But Shiro wasn't just the religious figurehead. He was about to become the strategic mind behind one of the most impossible last stands in samurai history. We're talking about a teenager who started with a few hundred starving farmers and turned them into a force that would humiliate the mighty Tokugawa Shogunate. But how does a 16-year-old boy end up commanding a fortress against an army that outnumbers him 30 to 1? How does someone go from preaching to peasants to orchestrating a military defense that would be studied for centuries? The truth behind this story is even crazier than the numbers suggest, because this wasn't really a battle over land or taxes. This was a battle over faith, a foreign, forbidden faith that the shogun had vowed to wipe from Japan forever. To understand why an entire army had to be sent to destroy Hara Castle, you first need to understand the world these rebels lived in. The year is 1637. Japan is closed off from the world. The shogun, Tokugawa Iemitsu, rules with an iron fist. He's expelled nearly all foreigners and banned Christianity, seeing it as a threat to his absolute power. But on the Shimabara Peninsula, the peasants are desperate. They're crushed under impossible taxes, forced to starve while their lords live in luxury. And into this desperation, a new hope arrives. Christianity. It promised equality and a better life after death. And the local lords, they hated it. They saw it as rebellion disguised as prayer. So they cracked down. Hard. Crucifixions, beheadings, torture. You had to step on a sacred image of Jesus to prove you weren't a Christian. If you refused, you were dead. It was an early lesson for the villagers that faith could be more dangerous than any sword. But here's the crucial part. It wasn't just the peasants. When the shogunate banned Christianity, it created another dangerous class, the ronin, masterless samurai. These were highly trained warriors who had lost their lords and their income. They were wandering the countryside, armed, skilled, and with nothing left to lose. Many of these ronin had converted to Christianity. They found in this new faith a cause worth dying for, something greater than serving a lord. And when the peasants finally snapped and rebelled, it was these ronin who became their officers. They were the steel spine inside the rebel army. The peasants had the numbers and the passion, but the ronin had the training and the tactical knowledge. This combination, faith and steel, would make them infinitely more dangerous than anyone in the shogunate could have predicted. The rebellion exploded in December 1637, after yet another brutal tax collection that left children starving. A village on the Shimabara Peninsula rose up. They killed the local tax official and then looked for a leader. Their choice was Amakusa Shiro. With a core of several hundred ronin and thousands of peasants, they needed a fortress, and they found the perfect place, Hara Castle. It was an old, abandoned castle on a cliff overlooking the sea. Its walls were crumbling, but its position was a natural defensive masterpiece. On one side, steep cliffs dropped to the ocean. On the other, a narrow land approach that could be easily defended. The rebels poured into Hara Castle, fortifying its walls, digging trenches, and preparing for a siege. They knew the shogun's army was coming. They knew they were outnumbered, but they had something the shogunate's soldiers did not. They believed God was on their side, and they had already accepted they were going to die. In war, an army that has accepted its death is the most dangerous army of all. The shogunate's response was swift and brutal. They sent an army of over 10,000 samurai, led by the daimyo Itakura Shig. This wasn't just an army, it was a statement, the might of the Tokugawa Shogunate coming down on a bunch of peasants and a few hundred ronin. The samurai outside the walls were confident, arrogant even. They expected the rebels to break at the first sight of their banners. They set up their camps, their siege lines, and prepared for a quick, decisive victory. But the rebels inside Hara Castle, they had a different plan. You see, while the shogunate's army was a traditional samurai force, built for honorable frontal assaults, the rebels were about to invent a new kind of warfare, a desperate, brutal, and brilliantly clever kind. Amakusa Shiro and his ronin commanders did something unprecedented. They didn't just sit behind their walls and wait. They used the one advantage they had, the absolute commitment of every single person inside. Women and children built new fortifications and repaired walls under arrow fire. The ronin trained the peasants in the use of the few muskets they had, and how to work their secret weapon, European cannons. That's right, this ragtag group of rebels had cannons. They had acquired them from old Portuguese trading ships before the ban. And while the shogunate's army was armed with traditional matchlock rifles, the rebels could fire cannonballs that could tear through entire ranks of samurai. But here's what's really interesting though. The rebels' greatest innovation wasn't their weapons. It was their intelligence and their use of psychological warfare. They understood the samurai mind. They knew their enemy was bound by honor and prone to underestimation. So, they used that against them. Under the cover of darkness, small teams of ronin would slip out of the castle. They weren't just on reconnaissance missions. They were hunting. They would infiltrate these samurai camps, silent as shadows, and assassinate officers in their sleep. They would set fire to supply depots, creating chaos and confusion. The next morning, the shogunate soldiers would find their comrades dead, with a Christian cross carved into their armor. The message was clear: your walls and numbers cannot keep you safe from us. The first major assault was a bloodbath. The shogunate commanders, confident and impatient, ordered a full-scale attack on the landward walls. Thousands of samurai charged forward, expecting to easily overrun the defenses, but they ran straight into a killing zone the rebels had prepared. The ronin had dug hidden pits filled with sharpened bamboo stakes. They had positioned their musketeers in overlapping fields of fire, and as the samurai reached the base of the walls, the rebels unleashed their cannons. The effect was devastating. The cannon fire scythed through the packed ranks of the attackers. Samurai, who had spent their whole lives training for single combat, were torn apart by projectiles they couldn't even see coming. The survivors were picked off by musket fire and arrows from the walls. The attack was a complete and utter failure. The shogunate army was thrown back in disarray, leaving hundreds of their best warriors dead in the mud. For the shogunate commanders, this wasn't just a defeat, it was a humiliation. A modern professional army had been beaten by peasants. The general, Itakura Shigomasa, was furious. He'd promised the shogun a quick victory. Now, he was stuck in a prolonged siege, his reputation crumbling faster than Hara Castle's walls. He tried everything. He launched more frontal assaults, each one more costly than the last. He tried to build siege towers. The rebels burned them with fire arrows. He tried to tunnel under the walls. The rebels dug counter-tunnels and ambushed the miners in the dark, cramped spaces underground. The rebels were always one step ahead. They fought with a ferocity that stunned the seasoned samurai. They would rather die than surrender. Women fought alongside men, using farming tools as weapons. Children carried messages and supplies under heavy fire. The siege dragged on for weeks, then months. The shogunate army, designed for quick campaigns, was rotting in its camps. Disease began to spread. Morale plummeted. Inside Hara Castle, the situation was even more dire. Food was almost gone. Ammunition was running low. But their will was unbroken. They had proven they could bleed the shogunate. Now, they were about to prove they could break its spirit. As the siege entered its third month, something had to give. The shogunate was losing face. News of this embarrassing stalemate was spreading across Japan. The shogun himself was getting impatient. So, he did what any absolute ruler would do. He sent a new commander, Matsuda Nobutsuna, with fresh troops and a simple order: end this. Now. No more honor. No more traditional assaults. This was to be total annihilation. But before the final storm, Nobutsuna decided to try one last trick. He sent a messenger to the castle under a flag of truce. The offer was simple and brutal. surrender Amakusa Shiro and the ronin leaders, and the peasants would be spared. It was a lie, of course, designed to create division, but the rebels' response would become legendary. They didn't even entertain the offer. Instead, they fired the messenger's horse out from under him with a musket shot and sent him running back to the shogunate lines on foot. The message was clear: we do not negotiate. We do not surrender. We will all die together. This act of defiance sealed their fate. Matsuda Nobutsuna knew then that there was only one way this could end: a final, overwhelming assault that would leave no one alive. But the rebels had one last, desperate plan. A plan so insane it almost worked. They decided that instead of waiting to be slaughtered inside their crumbling fortress, they would launch a full-scale night attack on the shogunate headquarters. They would try to decapitate the army by killing its commander. Picture the scene: a moonless night. The 300 remaining able-bodied warriors, the last of the ronin and the strongest peasants, gathered at the main gate. They said their prayers. They tied white hachimaki headbands around their foreheads, the symbol of a man prepared for death. They weren't trying to break out, they were trying to break in, to the very heart of the enemy camp. At a silent signal, the gates swung open, and this small force charged out, not with a battle cry, but in utter silence. They moved like ghosts through the samurai picket lines, killing sentries before they could raise an alarm. Their target was Matsuda Nobutsuna's command tent, visible by its banners in the center of the camp. For a few breathtaking minutes, it worked. The shogunate army was completely unprepared for an attack. They were besiegers, not the besieged. The rebel force cut a bloody path straight through the camp, their swords glinting in the light of the cooking fires. They fought with a supernatural fury, the 300 against 10,000. They reached the inner compound and began cutting down the commander's personal guard. The entire shogunate army was on the verge of a catastrophic rout from a force a fraction of its size. But then, the numbers told. The surprise wore off. The samurai regrouped. The rebel charge, so devastatingly effective at first, began to slow as they were surrounded on all sides. The fight turned into a series of isolated, desperate last stands. Small groups of rebels, back to back, fighting off waves of samurai until they were finally cut down. As the sun rose, the night attack was over. The ground around the command tent was carpeted with the bodies of the rebel elite. Nearly all 300 were dead. They had failed in their ultimate goal, but they had succeeded in proving their point. They had shown the shogunate that their spirit could not be broken. They had shamed the professional army one last time. Inside Hara Castle, the sound of the fighting had faded. The defenders knew what that meant. Their best warriors were gone. Now, it was their turn. With no soldiers left, the final defense of Hara Castle would fall to the wounded, the starving, and the desperate. The shogunate army, humiliated and enraged by the night attack, now prepared for their final, vengeful assault. There would be no mercy. The final assault began at dawn. With the rebel warriors gone, the shogunate army swarmed over the broken walls like ants. There was no one left to stop them. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a massacre. The samurai, furious and vengeful after months of humiliation, killed everyone they found. Men, women, children, the wounded, the sick. They were all put to the sword. The castle grounds ran red with blood. Amakusa Shiro, the 16-year-old leader, was found among the dead, his body riddled with arrows and sword cuts. The shogunate had won, but their victory was hollow. Drenched in the blood of 37,000 rebels, they had spent a fortune and lost thousands of their own samurai to crush a rebellion of starving peasants. They had won the castle, but they had lost their invincibility. But here's the crucial part of the story. The Siege of Hara Castle didn't just end with a massacre, it forced the Tokugawa Shogunate to look in the mirror, and what they saw terrified them. Their traditional way of war relying on samurai honor and frontal assaults was obsolete. A bunch of peasants and ronin using European cannons, guerrilla tactics, and psychological warfare had held them off for months and inflicted catastrophic casualties. The shogunate realized it needed to change. Immediately after the rebellion, they issued the Sakoku Edict, completely and totally closing Japan off from the outside world. Why? Because they were terrified of foreign ideas, foreign weapons, and foreign faith. The rebellion had shown them how dangerous these things could be. They also reformed their entire military doctrine. They began to invest heavily in their own artillery and siegecraft. Studying what went wrong at Hara, they cracked down even harder on any potential dissent, ensuring no other region could ever rise up like Shimabara again. The rebellion was so traumatic to the ruling class that its memory shaped Japanese policy for the next 200 years. In a twisted way, the 300 samurai and their rebel army had won a kind of victory. They had changed Japan forever. Ultimately, though, the people who suffered most were the innocent. The tens of thousands of peasants who simply wanted to live and worship in peace, who were brutally exterminated to the last person. Their story is a stark reminder that in war, it's rarely the leaders who pay the highest price. What is clear is that the Siege of Hara Castle was an example of how desperation can become a weapon, how faith can make ordinary people do extraordinary things. The rebels were crushed, yes, but their last stand echoes through history as one of the most defiant, strategically brilliant, and tragic episodes in the age of the samurai. Now, whilst the story of the Shimabara Rebellion is pretty incredible, I still wouldn't call it the most ruthless last stand in samurai history. For that, you're going to want to check out the absolutely insane story of the Shishichi Ronin, a tale of revenge so brutal and so patient that it ended with an entire clan being wiped out and the shogun himself having to step in. It makes the Siege of Hara look like a minor skirmish. The video is on screen now. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.